Dearest League players, I hope this finds you well. Hello, I'm David Phreak Turley, Summoners Rift Team's Live Pods design lead, here to talk about 13.24b. There is a micro patch, it's right up there, and let's talk about it. There's not a huge amount of changes going on. This hopefully is going to be very short, but yes, we are doing a micro patch into this. This came out as of time of recording about 24 hours ago. It was 6:30 at night yesterday. So let's talk about what's in the micro patch. First up, we are buffing Corki. Corki has been bad for a while. I've been trying to nudge us towards buffing him for a bit, and we finally got the space too, which is good. So I think longer term, it would be good if Corki were once again a viable bot laner. This would have to entail pretty heavily untethering a lot of his level scaling. In so doing, that will, I don't want to say guarantee, but it will nudge him toward elite skew, which can nudge him toward being pro-jailed. So there is a little bit of possibility that it goes wrong if Corki gets pro-jailed and is a 45% win rate champion because of pro-jail. I don't think that is very likely on an AD build. I think it's only really the AP builds that got jailed before, but it is a concern that the end result could be that Corki's worse off than before if we do it too much. I don't think this patch gets him back into the right spot in bot lane, don't get me wrong. Either way, would like to at least nudge him up in that direction. I think it'd be useful. Regardless, here is a move around on Corki. This very lightly nudges him toward playing his AD builds, toward playing aggressive builds, towards playing with Trinity Force. Those are all the kind of considerations here in what I went for. There was a version that I concepted. I did the changes here to Corki in this patch that tried to level out the ulti scaling quite a bit. That was pretty risky because the more levers you add, the harder it is to get them right, and so ultimately went for fairly safe numbers. There's a pretty good chance these buffs are actually under magnitude, because what's happening here is there's really substantial level 1 gains in both health and attack damage. This health nudges him closer to Tristana. That's why I went for her. I was thinking of Tristana as the target champion of, here's someone who can W forward and take a long duration sort of short trade. And so I looked at Tristana's level 1 health and was like, actually 640 is probably reasonable. We could probably swing that, make Corki a bit better early, make him more aggressive, make him less of a poke champion. Let's give him some durability. And so the first version of changes that I actually submitted internally was 60 level 1 AD and 640 base health, and then a bigger nerf on the health and attack damage growth to break even at level 18. Now, if you give someone 5 attack damage, that's like 1.5 to 2% win rate. If you give someone 42 health, that's 1.5% win rate. That's clearly more power than I think Corki needs. I don't think we can give him close to 3% win rate. I don't think he needs that much. Those changes would very slightly skew towards bot lane, but I don't think Corki should get a 3% win rate buff this patch. So I was like, okay, well, we can walk this down a little bit and have it taper off by level 18. Because we haven't done that very often, and because Corki has strong Sheen synergy, a base AD buff is a much bigger deal than it could be otherwise. And so through an abundance of caution, I still really wanted to give Corki a good amount of base health. I wanted to do compensation changes to bring up bot more than mid lane, right? Because mid lane gains more XP than bot lane does. So any taper off by level is going to disproportionately help bot lane more than mid lane in a way where we can maybe do this a little bit harder. We can go again, give him a little bit more AD, a little bit more health. And if we can, measure the magnitude of this effect, and it's like, oh, 4 AD and 30 health that we take back by level 16-ish is actually only 1% win rate in mid lane, and it's 1.5 in bot lane. Oh, we can do it again, and we know how much room we have, right? So this at least gives us some information sort of long term that we can use, but regardless, again, we're being a little conservative here. I don't think it's going to be OP in either context, but ultimately there's not a lot of time to play test this, and everyone is going to be locked onto this patch for about 4 weeks. And so because it's a 4-week patch that we can't react to in any meaningful way, went a little conservative, pretty long preamble, but those were kind of the ideas behind the change. Let's talk about the numbers. Flashbang warning. Okay, so here is the base attack damage of Corki before and after. Clearly a break even by level 16 is of course a strict buff. This is win rate positive. I don't want to say, I guess, strict buff, but this is win rate positive in all contexts. In any elo in any matchmaking bracket for any skill level of player, mastery level of player. Like, this is obviously just a buff to the champion. He has more attack damage for a large portion of the game, and so he's of course quite a bit better. This is disproportionately better in bot lane than in mid lane, which is intentional, but otherwise, again, directly a Corki buff. The one thing I want to point out with the base attack damage stuff here is actually that Corki, up until now, had what I thought was kind of a criminally low base attack damage. I don't like... So the thing is, AD carries often run an attack damage stat shard sometimes too, and they also often run something like a Doran's Blade, so they very frequently have 75 to 80 attack damage at level 1. That's actually very, very common. And if you have 4 less AD, you still have 70 to 75. It's still a lot, of course, but I don't know, it rubs me a little bit the wrong way when you have just like extremely low attack damage. You're meant to be an auto-attacker, and so I brought him up to what I think is kind of the low-ish end baseline. There are reasons to be below this, to be clear, but to me, Corki didn't feel like the kind of champion who deserved to have the worst base AD in the game. To be fair, that's actually canon. So it was kind of a thing here, and again, just picking very simple levers, ones that we can skew towards bot lane. This is base AD, which is basically how much value you're getting out of a Sheen, and double this how much value you're getting out of a Trinity Force. Again, it's better. On this side is a rough approximation of bonus attack damage growth from item purchases as you go towards 3, 4, 5 items, and so, of course, the green and red cells are no different, but in terms of the actual like percentage difference in how much damage you're dealing, that's the numbers there, and of course, still a pretty meaningful buff. The second change is to base health. The break even here is level 14, still a buff overall. Yes, level 14 is going to be reached, a solid halfway through the game, sure. So, for, I guess, half the game, for Corki mid, it's technically in the red, but the, level 18, 12 health difference is much less important than the level 1, 22 health difference that is going to matter more for the early trading. This is always going to matter more, so it's going to be win rate positive here as well for Corki. Again, trying to incentivize that he can be an early aggressive champion, and less, like, his strengths are less about poke and more about his ability to do normal marksman things. Valkyrie forward, stay in range of the E. Keep in mind that Corki has an incentive to stay in range, right-clicking his opponent through his E, so I think Corki is the kind of champion who deserves to have fairly high durability. Yes, he can play poke. Yes, he can Valkyrie raid. Yes, he has tools for safety, and it's always scary to have a poke champion with a backwards dash. Like, that's a very difficult thing to deal with, and so, hey, his level 14, 15, 12, whatever durability, when this poke is actually online and the long-term sieges exist, well, that's actually not any better here. And so it's his ability to early mid-game play more of a scrap. That's where it's better. Again, I don't think this is going to suddenly make Corki the best champ of the game, the best design champ of the game, but at least trying to nudge him in the direction of things that I think are very good, and so hopefully these at least go in the right direction here. Next is a large set of changes to Hwei, his second Micropatch set of buffs here post-launch. I think he's around like 35-ish, 37 maybe % win rate. He still has some room to go up. Of course, again, we are going to be in this patch for about 4 weeks, so I don't think he's going to gain enough win rate from Mastery Growth. He's going to hit above 50% on, the last day before we ship 14.1 in January, but regardless, 30 base health is usually about 1% win rate. This is a 35 flat mana, which I don't know what the mag would be here. 5 move speed is usually a bit south of 1% win rate, and then a 10 to 30 bump on the shield. You max W last. E sets up a bit sooner. E fires a bit sooner. E chases a bit farther. E, even if you place it on yourself, has a short no longer has a short linger. This was actually this existing actually was the designer was, I remember just having a conversation about this one just sort of offhand, which was he was concerned over Hwei being incredibly safe by being like, oh, okay, if you want to even dare to come at me, I'm just gonna EW on my feet, and as a melee champion, you just don't get to play the game because I've got up to 3 seconds of saying you can't play the game. You're not allowed to do any Z things, not allowed to do Katarina things, not allowed to do Talon things. I'm just immune to you for 3 seconds. Okay, I'm walking to my tower, bye. And he was afraid of it being like a long duration guaranteed safety tool. I assume he feels that's less the case watching his games actually play out. I am not super up to speed personally in how Hwei, other than like win rate stuff, I'm just not paying attention to him specifically. I'm working on other stuff. But essentially seems to not believe that this is a required sort of compensation anymore, so a little bit easier to learn. I think that's also very useful, right? It's one fewer rule to have to learn as a Hwei player. Doesn't have to have a reduced linger based on all of that. So I think all reasonable stuff here. Anyway, let's talk about the numbers of what these mean. So Hwei has some more base health, a pretty meaningful change. Of course, again, I mentioned this is about 1% win rate. I think it's pretty reasonable here. Here's the difference in the 35 mana as well. Of course, we're not counting for Lost Chapter or Mana Flow Band as well. So in the real world, the total mana difference is not quite so stark, but regardless, still more mana to cast spells with, more health to survive early trades with. No longer has pretty much worse than class mage health. 5 move speed, of course, valuable as well. Here is an approximation of how much shielding is coming out of the W. This is double stat shards, Doran's Ring. I'm getting like 500 AP at level 18. And you can see that, hey, actually a pretty solid buff for the shield. Keep in mind you max ability last. So you get the full 1 point wonder plus 10 shield value up until level 13. And then as the rank scaling kicks in from 14 upwards, you still have about, a 6%-ish stronger shield. Average out across the course of the game, which is pretty solid, right? And this is a pretty good shield overall, right? We're looking at, what's your like level 16 shielding value. Late game sieging, actually, yeah, pretty solid 800, 400 AoE shield, put on 2 people, it's 800 health, it's a lot. So, seems like a pretty strong ability. Cool stuff there. Identifying what spells people are using. I know we can do metrics for, I don't know if we have it right away. I haven't looked at it, but we can do metrics for like, what spells do people cast most frequently? And if we care about figuring that stuff out and trying to equalize it, we can do all kinds of cool, tuning to be like, oh, actually, we want to make sure that Hwei is casting WQ more often because there's all kind of stuff we can do, right? And like we can dive in all that kind of stuff. So, at some other point in time, maybe a longer term project, but either way, some buffs to Hwei. And I mean, yeah, it's obviously a pretty big surge in power. Naafiri, as mentioned, got over nerfed back in point, was it 23? I think it was point 23. And instead of waiting for the assassin item update, decided that, you know what, for the last month of the season, yeah, I think it's pretty valuable to say here, just go have some power, go gain a bit more. Naafiri is a relatively easy to play for assassin. That's intentional, is meant to be low elo skewed, is meant to be somewhat low agency, right? Because players can block your big W dash and whatnot. So, this means that Naafiri is kind of the sort of champion that deserves to have a pretty decent win rate in low elo. And so as Naafiri went down to like 50.5 in low, we'd like to bring her higher than that. And so giving her just a little bit of power is not a huge boost, but it does, of course, do something. More trading with the E, more mobility with the E, more dog control with the E here as well. 1 second cooldown. Not a big deal, but here's the math. You max a second. Not much to say here. It's a buff. Okay, great. Nico bug fix. I think this is related to things like attack speed. I don't remember 100%. I didn't work on this, but Nico bug fix seems good. Next change is to Orianna. So I want to talk about why there are changes to a bunch of mid lane mage type champions this patch and there weren't earlier. So one of the primary things is, hey, we obviously aren't playing any esports on this patch, so any champion driven by pro play is irrelevant. So doesn't matter that Orianna was the most picked champion at Worlds. That's not the reason we're making Orianna changes. Doesn't matter that they were playing, I forget what else was super common. I'm already blanking even though I watch like every game. Whatever. Doesn't matter what else is super common. Right? It truly doesn't matter because it's not going to be the focus. And the weird side point here. So a couple various other thoughts. One of which is the vast majority of players, and not just players, but like player hours, are played in low elo. So obviously there are more Iron players than Challenger players, or Masters Plus players even. But even though the average Masters Plus player plays more games than the average Iron player, there are still more games played in Iron than games played in Masters Plus. I don't think Iron players are less valuable than Masters players. If you're playing League of Legends, you're a League of Legends player. As far as I'm concerned, full stop. There are room for caveats like, okay, if Challenger players are more likely to stream and those streamers get viewership, then there are players, just like people who enjoy League of Legends via watching streams. And so if you're like, well, I'm a Cadril enjoyer or I'm a Dante's enjoyer, and it's like, okay, well, actually Dante's games are worth a little bit more than the average silver game because there's also 5,000 people watching him play Hecarim or whatever, right? It's like, that's also to me not irrelevant. I think that's actually a fair thing to say that, well, actually, through that lens, you could argue that high elo players are, in some very specific cases, worth more. I think there's a reasonable argument there that I think I'm willing to like entertain and kind of hold up with. And of course, on the even larger level, there's like, well, there's esports games where, now to be clear, like, there are, millions of Iron games every month, right? And I guess to be fair, there's like millions of like esports games watched every month as well. Like, not counting Worlds. Like, Worlds and MSI are obviously outliers, and they're like, yeah, we're going to like be very obvious that we're going to do balance for MSI and Worlds, and like, this is an esports patch. It's for a big tournament. I'm a little undecided on how we should feel about the regular season. I think, to be clear, I think we over prioritized pro play for generic patches in 2023. I would like to prioritize pro play less in 2024. And the primary lens through which I think this is reasonable to do is to say, well, let's try to be more equitable about how we treat each League of Legends player and how they spend their time playing the game. And this means we shouldn't over-prioritize pro. Yes, hundreds of thousands of people are going to watch G2 versus Fnatic, and fewer are going to watch, not G2 versus Fnatic. Fine. But obviously there are a lot of game hours there, so even though, like, Faker is only one League of Legends player, a lot of people watch Faker play League of Legends, so guess what? His games kind of mean more through the same lens that people on Twitch and YouTube also debatably also mean more, right? So it's not that they shouldn't matter and shouldn't be looked at, but it just means that we need to make sure we don't lose sight of the, like, massive majority of players that are not in Emerald Plus. Like, I know the default win rate view of pretty much any stats website, whether you're going to like u.eg or Lawlytics or anything else, is Emerald Plus. And it's like, well, that's nice, but that's like 25, I think, percent of like all games are in Emerald Plus, and 3 times that many are Plat and lower. So if we're prioritizing League of Legends players, of which there are 100 million-ish, guess what? There aren't, it's like the massive difference in number of people and hours spent is really big. I'm spending a long time on this, but it's like, again, I don't have like the full answer here on how we should actually think about this, but I just really want to bring this up as a very meaningful thing that like matters a lot, that we truly should not and cannot ignore the majority of our players. And this all circles back to the idea that obviously we're past the Worlds patch. Doing balance for pro play is clearly not correct. So there are changes, of course, to Orianna, Sylas, and Syndra, as you can see on the screen here in this patch. And what ultimately led us doing it this patch is not obviously pro play, because duh. It's really the degree that these champions have caught on everywhere. So win rate wise, Orianna's win rate really hasn't moved. Her win rate is basically 1% below 50% in Iron and 1% above 50% win rate in Masters Plus. And that was true before Worlds. Like, before her pick rate skyrocketed because of Worlds, because she was the number 1 mid laner at Worlds, she was still a 50% win rate mid laner. And we're like, yo, Ori's at 50%? Why the hell is she not a pro play pick? And then she became the number 1 champion at Worlds. And it's like, they finally realized the like 6 health growth we gave her was clearly pushed her over the edge. Doubt. So despite the fact that Orianna has inflated her number of players massively, she's not having a huge win rate drop off. Like, the number of champions who actually lose win rate when they gain a bunch of players is very small. It's champions like Azir and Cassante who are extremely, extremely high skill curve. Orianna is not one of these champions. All of Orianna's skills pretty much just make sense out of the box. And it's like, yeah, I press the button on you and it deals damage. I'm basically a mage. And yeah, there is a total of a 2% win rate gain between Iron and Masters. Yeah, that's negligible. That just doesn't matter. So don't care, right? That basically doesn't exist. For a champion that scales with your teammate's skill, right? They use the ball well, they flash in your shockwave or whatever. A 2% between Iron and Masters functionally doesn't exist at that point. Clearly, Orianna is not this high mastery, incredibly high skill cap, incredibly low counterplay champion. So I basically categorically reject that Orianna is somehow intrinsically actually overpowered. I'm not trying to overtunnel on win rate, but it's like this metric does exist. To get to the point I'm trying to get to, though, is Orianna is worth nerfing when she actually takes over the minds of kind of all of League of Legends players. This is not like win rate by itself, but pick rate and ban rate. And yes, her pick rate and ban rate are higher in Master than they are in Iron, but even in Iron, she has like a 7% ban rate or something for a 49% win rate mid laner. Okay, even in incredibly low ranks of play, people are like, they believe Orianna is overpowered and needs to be banned and is too strong of a champion. Cool. Enough of the player base has caught it. And again, she's still higher pick rate and higher ban rate and higher win rate and higher elos. But it's like, okay, let's take the look of all players together. And, oh no, like, and I'm going to be a little, not incendiary, because I'm not going to be that incendiary here, but it's like, oh no, mages are good, right? For how much consternation champions like Yone and Zed and whatever get, it's like, oh man, mages are good in mid lane? Oh no, how dare Riot have a mage be an S tier mid laner? That's not allowed to happen, right? Like outside of pro play, because obviously pro play is mage only and has been for 11 years, basically. Sure, whatever, we're not getting away from that in any meaningful way, in any easy way, but the fact that, like, oh man, and mages are finally believed to be the best champions in solo queue. Like, were you around with all of the Riot hates mages, mages suck stuff? I was seeing that all year, and it's like, well, I watch the best players in the world play, and they still only play mages, so I, doubt that one. But, just the idea that mages are doing very well does not mean that the game is broken. Someone has to be believed to be the best champion in the game. I don't think it's necessarily wrong if that is Orianna, but also I think players... Weirdly, I think players would rather have musical chairs because someone's going to be considered number one. Like, no matter what, this is going to happen. And it's going to crystallize. And then people are going to be like, well, this is the best champion. And so the pick rate and the ban rate skyrockets. The win rate goes nowhere for most champions in the game who aren't Azir and Kazante. And then the community's like, why hasn't Riot nerfed this champion yet? It's like, well, because y'all just dogpiled it for no reason. The champion isn't overpowered. You just believe it is. Not that there can be exceptions or can't be exceptions here, but I'm spending a long time in hypotheticals. Anyway. So Orianna is certainly a champion that has caught on, has been dogpiled on, and is a champion that people believe is now one of, if not the best mid laner in League of Legends, and not just in Grandmaster solo queue, right? Not just in Korea or whatever. It's caught on worldwide, even in low elo, so okay, cool. Players worldwide believe Orianna is over. Okay, that's a pretty logical reason to go after it. The primary thrust to me is actually because of Sylas. I think Sylas is like actually the number one solo queue mid laner. I think he's actually the number one champion. I think Sylas is not the kind of champion that feels balanced to play against when he has a 51% win rate. Like Yone's at 48 and feels overpowered, even though he doesn't win all of his games. This is not to say that Yone isn't overpowered, but that Yone doesn't win half his games and players feel he is overpowered. Sylas wins more than half his games, and also players feel he is overpowered. Orianna wins exactly half her games, and players feel she is overpowered. Like these are different levels of champions, right? And here is, I'll pick another example. Who's a, I'm trying to think, I'm trying to think of like, Sona. Sona wins more than half her games, and no one thinks Sona is overpowered, generally speaking. Right? Not all champions are made the same. This is not just champion mastery or whatever. And again, I'm not trying to super tunnel on win rate because I'm not saying that, well, the win rate is this so they're not overpowered. I'm saying that the win rate is this and players feel this other thing. And these things are often not in relation to one another because it depends on the champion. That's all I'm really trying to say here. And I'm spending a long time dancing around it. I'm somehow making 20 minutes out of an 8 champion patch notes. This is wild. I can't stop myself. Okay. So to me, this is actually driven by Sylas, because if Sylas is actually the number one mid laner, which I believe he currently is for solo queue, the ones right behind him just become the number one in his stead. And so we needed to kind of do more than a one champion change to do a small mid lane meta shakeup for the last patch of the season, for the last month of ranked play. To me, this all made sense. And so it was essentially, to me, Sylas needed a pretty large nerf, like 1.5% win rate roughly. And then Syndra and Orianna, who are the ones that were falling right behind, needed about 1%. Wanted to go a little bit low here to say, hey, we've nerfed them. We've made a change. We think 1% win rate is more than enough to get people to move around and make a new move here. But these are champions who feel maybe the most unfair as lane bullies, whatever. Another thing as well is a surefire way to kick champions out of high ban rate and kick them out of pro play is to nuke their laning phases. Because pros care a lot about lane dominance, and looking at the types of champions people actually ban, it's really strongly correlated with champions who are good in lane. If a champion is good at killing you individually, you ban the champion. I actually got some data recently around what roles ban which champions. So, for example, a champion like Morgana support, or Morgana in general, is very frequently banned by supports because tank support players are the ones getting shut down by Morgana. And I'm thinking that Darius is another champion who is disproportionately banned by top laners because top laners don't want to lane against Darius. Meanwhile, a jungler like Evelynn is typically not actually banned by a jungler. Evelyn's bans come from junglers less than half the time. It's other people who say, I'm going to spend my ban on Evelynn because Evelynn kills me. The other jungler doesn't get screwed by Evelynn. It's the mid laner, the AD carry, who gets killed by Evelynn. Meanwhile, a champion like Aurelion Sol does not get banned by mid laners. He doesn't get banned very much at all, to be clear, but the champion's very, very strong. But mid laners don't ban Aurelion Sol because Aurelion Sol doesn't beat you in mid lane. People ban Aurelion Sol with like, Aurelion Sol wins the game. There's like the AD carry to support the top laner who goes like, doesn't matter what I do, Aurelion Sol wins the game. I'm not going to trust my mid laner to beat Aurelion Sol in mid. I'm going to ban Asol. And so the people ban things that directly beat them. And so people ban lane dominant champions who beat them in lane, or I'll call it like game dominant champions who win the game, but they don't play against them specifically. So it's really, really interesting that this is like very, very strongly true. All to say that if Orianna has a high ban rate, it's often because mid laners are banning Orianna. If Sylas is having a high ban rate, it's often because mid laners are banning Sylas. If Syndra has a high ban rate, it's often because mid laners are banning Syndra. And then champions who tend to have diffuse ban rates, on average, just tend to be low ban rate champions. That's not always true, but it's also correlated. Low ban rate champions tend to just, I mean, their bans come from somewhere, and so if you're summing all their bans, it just ends up being diffuse because someone's like, I don't know, I'm gonna ban Aurelion Sol, whatever, it's I don't care, whatever. Right? You just like sort Lawlytics PBI and it's like, this champion is popular enough and it wins a lot of games, so we just throw it in there, you know, that kind of thing. Okay. Long preamble here. We could have just said we're going to go after your laning phase, and to a certain degree this like happened a little bit, but generally speaking, we're trying to not essentially trying to say that mid laners are allowed to have good laning phases. Yes, and that's just how it is. Mages are allowed to have good laning phase, and this might mean that Orianna's still going to be a big pro play champion, but also she's a 50% win rate mid laner. You know, it's not like she's in dire straits of being pro GLD here. Okay, let's finally talk about the topics themselves and the changes themselves. So there is a nerf to Orianna. The first thing that's happening here is this was the first line that we went for, which was the Orianna W speed boost here. We actually expect this to be somewhat elite skewed, since Orianna is a little bit elite skewed, and expect to be a little bit pro skewed, since roaming around the map and overall, gaining utility is going to generally skew with high elo. And hey, wouldn't it be nice if we flattened out Orianna's win rate by MMR without having to go after early versus late game scaling, because that's a very easy and very boring tactic. And I think we're trying to change power curves unintentionally less overall. So we're trying to use it as our tactic for a different goal, as opposed to, no, the goal is change win rate with game time, so we're going to affect your scaling. This is like, well, this is a tactic that will affect MMR skew, but we're not going to use scaling as a lever for it. So Orianna, we think this change is going to be MMR skewed, but also we were pretty confident that only seeing a 10% move speed nerf on W was going to make players be like, that's not a nerf, what are you doing, right? This doesn't count. So we added an extra nerf that was going to be worth about 0.5% win rate, which is Orianna's base health here. It's worth noting that because Orianna has self-shielding, that she has disproportionately high durability. What's also cool is this can theoretically open up a little bit. It's not by a large amount, but this directionally opens up some matchups against Orianna, because since the ball takes time to get back to her, if she's queuing out at range and you're hitting her from range and she goes for the QW combo and then tries to E back, where it's like, well, I'm LeBlanc, I QR'd you, or I QW'd you. This burst landed before you can bring the ball back. Any given ranged matchup, essentially Orianna has lower base health, but can't rely on the shield as easily, or she has to at least start with E and then QW auto and stuff. Like, it just makes it a little harder to play those matchups out. Whereas if you're against someone like Zed or Katarina, it's like, well, I'm just going to like start with the ball on me, you go into melee range, I QW, it's just like the pattern is just easier, right? So this very, very lightly, and again, very lightly, moves Orianna towards being a bit weaker against ranged champions more than melee champions. Again, very, very light here. In general, I think opening up some matchups for Orianna is probably a good thing overall. Her looking counterpickable, I think, is a positive. Regardless, all to say, That's the look here. It's a bit less health. It's a bit less mobility on the W. It's a bit less slow on the W as well. This could end up being a very, very heavy lever because it's both a move speed gained and a slow. There's a chance it's actually massive. I don't think it's going to be, but we know this is going to be about 0.5% win rate. And so if the win rate gain is substantially above that, we know that this lever is actually very, very delicate, and we can walk it back if needed or find something else to give her. The second change is to Sylas. I did the Sylas changes in this patch. I have a lot of thoughts on Sylas, and it's difficult. So there are several things that are strange outliers about Sylas. So number one, Sylas has basically the best stat growth in the game. His health growth, armor growth, and MR growth are all, I think, just second to Mega Gnar, and Mega Gnar is intentionally the highest in the game for very good reasons. Sylas is, I'm pretty sure, number 2 in like all of these categories, which is kind of strange. But it also allows him to be more than just a burst assassin in the late game, because there just aren't a lot of ways to be durable as a melee champion who doesn't have an Echo Shield and Echo Ulti, or is a pure assassin like Evelynn, or is a just like hard like burst diver like engager like Diana, where she's relying on Zhonya's anyway and the shield. And of course, Sylas used to have a shield on his E, and it made him pro jail because he would just E1 to block any harass ever, and we got rid of it for a decent reason. So Sylas has a lot of baseline durability, but it means that he has extreme outlier levels of base stats. Is what it is. The next thing is Sylas Q spam is pretty annoying. Most people don't do it, but it's very strong, and it's good into range matches. Most people don't realize you should actually Q max on Sylas into range matches. Most people just max W in every single game. People aren't smart. But pros actually do Q max. Now the thing is, Sylas is a relatively balanced pro play champion. I think he's too strong in solo queue. I think most people would agree with me. But he is fair in pro play. And him being able to Q max, though it's a little screwed up as an ability, is functionally what allows him to be a pro play champion, I would argue. So even though that ability is kind of messed up, it's not doing a lot of heavy lifting in solo queue and doing a lot of heavy lifting in pro play. So it's not a great nerf lever. The final thing to go for is E. Now, the thought I kind of have is with Sylas having pretty good baseline durability, with him being able to go items like Night Harvester or, I was going to say Serpent's Fang, Everfrost. Like, there are a couple of decent durability items. I mean, Roa, Zhonya's, Banshees, the Bjergsen no damage build, right? The Zhonya's Banshees Everfrost build. But it's like, yeah, okay, if Sylas is decent by building AP Bruiser, maybe he's got like good base damage or something like that, I don't know, then he can play around his passive and around repeat Ws, and he can be a long fight champion, a Mordekaiser style, without going for things like Jack Show. But, you know, maybe a little bit closer to like Diana, right? Where she builds an Asher Tooth, not to one-shot you. The unfortunate thing about that, and I think there is some room to say that, yes, Sylas is about long duration, fightier sort of outputs. The difficulty with that is E1 W auto Q is undodgeable. It's just 800 range targeted dash guaranteed damage. So if you're in auto attack range as Orianna, I'm in range of E1 W auto Q into auto. And then maybe I land E2 because maybe you're not in your wave. But the E2 is the only thing that's missable or dodgeable. Everything else is basically guaranteed in all contexts. And it's actually part of the reason why Akali E deals so much damage is the rest of her kit is basically guaranteed, and similar with Sylas here, where most of Sylas' kit is actually guaranteed. And it's really valuable that kits have variance in their combat output, so that a 10-0 Sylas could maybe lose because maybe E2 misses, right? And the more of Sylas' power is in E2. He has to rank E second, and the skill shot does a lot of damage, the AP ratio is very high, the base damage is very high. The more that's in E2 for Sylas, that is the one skill shot on his entire kit. That's the one thing that's actually missable, because Q1 is functionally unmissable. Q2, okay, a little better, right? At least you can like use some dash. LeBlanc can get out, Vayne can get out, whatever. And so that's, to me, the most pervasive, well, I should say persuasive lever is E2, though it really chunks and makes him more of an assassin who happens to be tanky and heals himself than a fighter. I think making that happen would be very difficult. But if Sylas is just simply, at least has the combat variance of maybe he can miss E2, then at least there's some combat variance to Sylas, and this makes it healthier overall, so that a snowballed Sylas can still fail sometimes, in the way that a snowballed Ashe can still get one shot by Zed, in a way that a snowballed Orin still can't really kill you, and a snowballed fighter can be kited and worn down because they can't become invulnerable. So yeah, there should be a little something here that says Sylas can fail even when ahead, and this means that power has to be in the E. So this comes down to the most guaranteed part of Sylas' is what's getting nerfed, which is the W. This has the effect of nerfing him primarily in melee matchups compared to ranged ones, since in melee matchups he has infinite access to his W. All makes sense there. And so it is both a small base damage on W, targeting early game by doing 5 flat damage, but also dropping some of the gold scaling of the champion as well. In my belief, Sylas snowballs a little bit too hard, and so I would like Sylas to snowball less. Now, I still think mid lane overall can deal with slightly better snowballing. To be fair, I think at 14-1, mage items are getting buffed, and so the lane will be more snowballing, which is good. Not by a large degree, but just some, right? The gold scaling of mid lane, I think, should go up on average, but it doesn't have to happen in every single case, so the gold scaling of Sylas goes down. The other thing is, again, I mentioned how Sylas has very little of his kit that is not guaranteed, and so it was going after the snowballing of the guaranteed parts of the kit. The fact that he can chain heal himself to fairly much full, it's worth noting, I wanted to kind of reiterate here, I wrote this part of the note, more or less, which is that you get the double heal value at only 60% missing. So if Sylas is at 40% health, he's getting the full double heal value. Which is maybe not incorrect, but it means that Sylas very frequently gets access to the double heal value. It's actually quite easy to be at 40%. You are a melee champion after all. It's not that hard to get worn down, which means it's very easy to get a 200 plus 80% AP heal, which is quite a lot. Obviously, that's very, very aggressive scaling. And so I wanted to lower this scaling down. It can be doubled. It's now 200 plus 70% AP, which is still an aggressive ratio. Like most of Sylas' spells don't take 300 ability power to triple their damage, which means Sylas is still very much advised to build ability power. He is still one of the most gold snowbally mages in the game. He might be number 1. Maybe Evelyn's higher if you want to call her a mage. So it's still true about Sylas, just going down from clearly number 1 to definitely number 1 kind of thing. So anyway, long preamble. Here's the numbers on Sylas. So expecting him to get Doran's Ring double stat shard and going for about 500 bonus ability power via items. Here is the amount of damage coming out of W, and it's down, about 7% based on game time, based on whatever. Here is the healing. It goes down with gold income because the flat didn't change, so it's down 5 to almost 10%. If you really snowball, Maji's Death Cap, 700 ability power, then it's going to be even larger than that. It's going to be down like 11%, but often not reached there. So yes, the snowballiness of Sylas is down. We expect this to be a moderately sized nerf. That's the case here. Final change is to Syndra. I don't think Syndra necessarily had to have an AP ratio nerf. It happened here. I think it's fine. Q is a primary damage tool of Syndra. We are not going after early laning phase. I think, again, champions are allowed to be good at laning. Mages are allowed to be good at laning, so not really targeting her early game very strongly. Also, his bug fix, I think, should definitely be meaningful, so we'll see if this ends up being a decent amount of win rate. Of course, she's not buying GA, and she has Zillion on her team very, very rarely, but hey, this is win rate positive in some number of games. And then the big thing, though, is, yeah, a 10% AP ratio nerf on Q is actually a pretty big deal. Here is the math on a 10% AP ratio nerf on Q, which, again, double stat shard Doran's Ring, if you don't run for attack speed or whatever, is already a 4% damage nerf in the early game, and you can see it trends down towards about a 9% damage nerf late game, very similar to the Sylas nerf over here. In fact, the numbers are nearly identical, with this going from 80 to 70, this going from 70 to 60. You can see, pretty similar stuff overall. Not much more to say about this other than, yeah, it is a modern nerf for Syndra. It is overall lowering her snowballing a little bit. We are definitely taking some of her gold scaling down. That's obviously going to be true here. But Q is kind of unmissable, and so this requires her to land more of her kit, which I think is reasonable here as well for the champion overall. Clearly seems to be a little bit too good, so down it goes. Next and final buff of the patch is one to Warwick jungle specifically. So the point here is that Warwick top is fine. Warwick jungle is actually very popular in low elo, but even in low MR, where he's an easy to play kind of training wheels jungler, he is not successful. Warwick is a bad jungler everywhere, and so trying to open this up a little bit. Now, what's nice is early game clear speeds tend to be high elo skewed. Warwick is even worse in high elo. I don't expect Warwick to reach anywhere close to 50% win rate in high MMR, but it is nice to just make him do a bit better, which is kind of cool overall. So a 20-second cooldown refresh on the W, and a 50 to 10 damage increase on the Q. You functionally always hit cap against large monsters here, so this is a straight up 50 to 10 damage increase on Warwick Q straight up. And then to go with the cooldown buff here, stronger level up incentive on the W. You already maxes it first typically, but even more move speed when pressing the button. So let's talk about the numbers here for Warwick. Because Warwick doesn't tend to build very much attack damage, his most common builds on live are Blade of the Ruin King into full tank, basically. I basically didn't include any bonus attack damage for Warwick Q because it was small enough to not matter. And this is simply the fact that Q has a a total AD ratio, so Warwick's base AD. Plus, it is basically always hitting monster cap on any large monster. And so here is the total damage of Q before and after the changes. He maxes Q second, so you can see the damage bump is around... Am I doing... Hold on, let me double check something real quick. Is this actually... Yes, adding 20 damage. Okay, so the math is correct. Yeah, because it's basically getting nothing otherwise. He's getting like AD growth otherwise. Yeah. So this is the damage difference on every single Q cast in the jungle on large camps. Things like Big Raptor, you're not going to really notice it. Things like Big Wolf, you're not going to get the cap. The new cap very easily either, but it matters for the larger camps. So, you know, Red, Blue, Gromp, especially for the first clear. And then your damage starts kicking in a little bit nicer over time. But regardless, right, the damage difference here is not that negligible. It definitely does matter. This is the total damage of the Q. So a pretty big bump damage the spell actually deals, which is good. And then how much move speed comes out of the W, assuming you max it first, which you do. The majority of Warwicks in the jungle do max W first, even at level 4 and 5. So this is the total move speed provided to you before move speed caps and also before boots. Percentage-wise, it's going to be about the same, kind of no matter what, but this is how much stronger the W is at letting you into a gank and whatnot. So definitely a decent amount of power here. Again, the cooldown change, nice as well for getting up and going for ganks more often. Overall, cool stuff. Cool stuff for Warwick, good champion. Some buffs needed, and I don't expect this to be massive, but it is a good buff, I think, which is good. Final change is to Yone W. I do think we made mistakes earlier on when... Basically, Shieldbow went away from Yone and Yasuo, and they lost a ton of durability, which they needed in order to play functionally in team fights. And they lost a lot of win rate, even though, you know, and we like investigated, okay, what are your core builds with Gale Force or IE or whatever? They weren't making it up, and these champions were just pretty weak. And so we said, okay, well, your total damage was already fine. And of course, it, you know, arguably goes up a little bit with them getting, you know, switching out from shield mode to other damage options, but their durability clearly went down, so we should buff their durability back up. And I think the miss we had was that we buffed early durability when we should have buffed mid to late game durability. Certainly not getting to buy a Vamp Scepter on your first recall is a meaningful change from like level 5 onwards. But I think we should have been willing to say like that's going to be different and you're just going to have to deal with it. But it was the like level 10, 12 plus that we should have really targeted the buffs here, and we kind of didn't. And so all of our buffs to, I think both the champions, but I think especially Yone just ended up being early game. Yone got his early cooldown W decreased. He got, and basically every time we buffed the shield on Yone, we just gave the shield a flat like 10, 20, 30 shielding onto it. Which in retrospect, and as we learned, is like actually... We probably could have just given it shield scaling or something and left level 1 value, and it would have been the better shape. Ultimately got into a state where Yone actually has a much flatter win rate curve, and he's actually quite good early game because we gave him a ton of early trading tools with a more frequent and much stronger W. And so we're trying to walk that back and do it the correct way, which is to no longer buff Yone's early shielding and early trading power, and still leave him as a strong late game champion that's meant to be kind of his sort of not mastery niche exactly, but his sort of niche in the game is a late game scaling champion who's not meant to have a great laning phase, maybe the tools to like withstand the damage, and so it's nerfing the shield early on. Basically going back on almost all of the shield buffs that we put on earlier on in the year, but not trying to overnerf him too heavily. Maybe you suggest that we should have nerfed him even harder, but we didn't. Either way, here is the math on the shield, and keep in mind that the shield itself has an AD ratio, so this nerf is not maybe quite as big as it looks, but still a pretty meaningful nerf. Now, he hasn't learned W at level 1, so I elected to not include it in a data table. But here is the amount of shield that W provides, assuming you hit one enemy champion with the W and you're building a decent amount of attack damage on curve, which is 1 stat shard on Doran's shield or Doran's blade at level 1, and then, you know, moving on to 250 or so bonus stack damage as you go on with items. Because around level like 17, you're about 3 items as a typical mid laner is where I typically see the math. So either way, here is the math, and yeah, it is a worse shield for a large portion of the game. This is still a very strong ability, right? This spell does like 70 damage or so at level 2, it's like a pretty good ability overall. And of course, it comes with a 100-point shield, which is like very strong, but it's also got a pretty moderate cooldown. This ability's strong, don't get me wrong, but he's also like very melee. Anyway, all to say that, yeah, early shielding down to make it much more likely that you can trade against Yone in the early game. For this, the ability is still good, it's still worth casting, and it certainly is, of course, but to try to ensure that you can trade back against Yone is kind of the direction here, the kind of the hope we're going for. And then, yeah, we're giving a little bit back late game because, we're doing it. Whatever. It's not a huge deal. It doesn't really matter. But I do think directionally this is kind of the right thing for him. So that is the nerf to Yone. I think we can probably do more directionally to make sure his early game weaknesses do exist. And if we think we've given him the right amount of durability to fully make up for shield bow, which I don't think we really have, because keep in mind, shield bow was like a 500 health shield and lifesteal. He is getting that, to be fair, with Hullbreaker's health. That item, of course, is getting changed in 14.1. I think the redesign of Hullbreaker for 14.1 is actually really, really, really good. But I fully expect we'll have to re-identify what's up with Yone when that item's gone as well, and he loses yet another health item that he was normally allowed to purchase. And it might be that it's the 80 ratio on the W, or the level 18 shield goes up to 110 or something, but I do want to preserve Yone's early frailty as, I think, very, very valuable. So that is a patch rundown. I spent a long time on some sort of outside topic theoretical stuff here, but hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it was valuable. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye.